The future of America's coastal cities is under a growing and undeniable threat. A NASA-led study has painted a grim picture of what lies ahead for millions of people living along the shores of the United States, particularly in California. Rising sea levels, combined with land subsidence, could render large sections of major metropolitan areas uninhabitable within the next 25 years. Los Angeles and San Francisco, two of the nation's most iconic cities, are set to be among the hardest hit, with sea levels projected to rise by as much as 14.5 inches by 2050, far surpassing previous estimates. This acceleration in ocean expansion is a clear indicator that climate change is advancing at a dangerous pace, with devastating consequences for infrastructure, economies, and communities. The research, conducted by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, reveals that parts of California's coastline are facing a dual catastrophe. Not only is the sea level rising at alarming rates, but the land itself is sinking in key areas, compounding the risk of severe flooding. This phenomenon, known as subsidence, is particularly pronounced in regions built on reclaimed land, such as parts of the San Francisco Bay Area. Cities like San Rafael, Corte Madera, Foster City, and Bay Farm Island are seeing their foundations slowly give way, creating conditions where even minor sea level rises can have catastrophic effects. Researchers note that in some locations, the ground is sinking even faster than the water is rising, making it inevitable that these areas will soon be permanently underwater. The consequences of these findings are staggering. The projected sea level rise means that flooding, once an occasional threat, will become a persistent and inescapable reality. Coastal highways, bridges, and underground transit systems are at risk of being submerged, cutting off essential transportation routes and threatening millions of daily commuters. Major airports, including San Francisco International Airport, are built at low elevations and could experience chronic flooding, severely disrupting travel and commerce. Ports along the California coast, which handle a significant percentage of U.S. imports and exports, could suffer operational breakdowns, leading to supply chain chaos and economic instability. The financial toll of this crisis cannot be overstated. California has already spent over $100 million since the 1960s trying to combat damage from land subsidence. But that figure will be a mere fraction of what will be needed to address the accelerating crisis. As more areas become uninhabitable, property values will plummet, leaving homeowners with assets that are rapidly losing their worth. Insurance companies, already pulling out of high-risk areas due to wildfire threats, may refuse to cover coastal properties altogether, making it nearly impossible for residents to protect their homes and businesses. The result will be a large-scale displacement crisis, forcing millions to relocate, straining resources in inland areas, and triggering a wave of economic and social instability. The threat of rising sea levels is not limited to California. Other major U.S. cities, including New York, Miami, and New Orleans, are facing similar existential dangers. Miami, in particular, is built on porous limestone, meaning that seawater will seep into underground aquifers, making flood control efforts even more challenging. New Orleans, which already sits below sea level, is vulnerable to even minor oceanic changes. New York, despite its efforts to reinforce its coastlines, remains highly exposed to the impact of storm surges, as demonstrated by the devastating floods brought by Hurricane Sandy in 2012. The destruction of these major economic and cultural centers would be a national disaster of unprecedented scale. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the response from policymakers has been slow and inadequate. Climate denialism, political inaction, and budget cuts to critical agencies have weakened the nation's ability to address this growing emergency. NOAA, one of the leading organizations studying climate change and sea level rise, has faced significant funding cuts, limiting its capacity to conduct research and implement necessary mitigation strategies. Similarly, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, has been stretched thin by increasing natural disasters, making it ill-prepared for the mass displacement and economic turmoil that rising sea levels will bring. The reality is that the time for debate has passed. Climate change is no longer a distant threat. It is happening now, with consequences that are growing more severe by the year. Scientists have been warning about these dangers for decades, yet their calls for urgent action have often been ignored or downplayed. Mitigation efforts, such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions, investing in resilient infrastructure, and implementing large-scale coastal defenses must be prioritized before it is too late. Failure to act will not only lead to the destruction of homes, businesses, and infrastructure, but will also mark the beginning of an era of permanent displacement, economic collapse, and environmental catastrophe. There is no easy solution to this crisis, but inaction is the worst possible response. Coastal cities across the U.S. must prepare for the inevitable while simultaneously working to slow the progression of climate change. Governments at all levels must take responsibility, implementing stricter environmental regulations, reinforcing at-risk areas, and providing financial support for communities that will be forced to relocate. If the current trajectory continues unchecked, the next generation will inherit a world where some of America's greatest cities exist only in history books, lost beneath the relentless rise of the sea. The choice is clear: take action now, or face a future where the warnings of today become the tragedies of tomorrow.